Have you ever wondered how the West controls African countries and everything that happens in them? Well, it's not done directly. Rather, various institutions and organizations have been established and given nice names to hide the disastrous effects. The IMF, or International Monetary Fund, is among the institutions established by the West that offer financial assistance or loans to countries facing economic turmoil. However, once the loan is offered, the IMF dictates what will happen in that country, the price of every commodity, and where the government should spend money. That's a strategy the West uses to secretly control African nations. Yet, bold African countries like Burkina Faso have become hard to handle for the West. Therefore, the IMF made a gigantic loan offer to the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traore. But interestingly, he turned it down in the boldest way, revealing why the offer was made and the West's evil plan about Burkina Faso. So what did the IMF want, and how has Ibrahim Traore failed its plans? Let's know about that in this video. Captain Ibrahim Traore, the military leader of Burkina Faso, is distinguishing himself from other African leaders, particularly in a continent where leaders have often recklessly accepted billions of dollars in loans from the IMF and the World Bank. Ibrahim Traore is one of the few leaders who have shown the courage to break away from this pattern. Recent reports suggest that he has declined financial assistance from the IMF, a significant and commendable move demonstrating his commitment to safeguarding his country's long-term interests. But why declining the loan offer is such a groundbreaking decision? Well, the loans offered by the IMF and the World Bank frequently come with stringent conditions that have had severe repercussions for borrowing countries. Unlike other leaders, Ibrahim Traore understands this and is taking decisive action to prevent his country from falling into a debt trap. Ibrahim Traore holds a strong belief that the IMF and the World Bank are economic oppressors. He views these organizations as structured in a manner that perpetuates countries' dependency on debt. The IMF and the World Bank leverage their lending power to exert control over the economies of borrowing countries, making it exceedingly difficult for them to break free from their influence. This level of control grants these organizations significant power over the politics of the country, a situation Ibrahim Traore finds unacceptable. He contends that African countries dependent on these organizations will never achieve economic freedom and will remain subordinate to the Western economy. As the youngest president in Africa, Ibrahim Traore has been vocal in his criticism of African leaders who act as mere puppets under Western influence. He has made it abundantly clear that he will not tolerate any form of Western intervention in his country's affairs. What's more, Burkina Faso's prime minister has boldly declared that it is preferable to be poor in a powerful state than to be rich in a poor and weak one. This sentiment aligns with Ibrahim Traore's decision to prioritize his country's sovereignty and long-term prosperity over short-term financial assistance with strings attached. President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso follows a philosophy that prioritizes strength and sovereignty above wealth and external dependence. This core belief originates from the idea that it's better for a nation to uphold its autonomy and resilience, even in the face of economic challenges, rather than becoming wealthy but vulnerable to external manipulation and exploitation. If the West has the only tool for creating economic turmoils in a state, so be it. But Burkina Faso won't surrender to this and ask for financial assistance that will trap it and end all its sovereignty. At its core, Traore's philosophy revolves around safeguarding Burkina Faso's sovereignty and independence. He understands that relying on external entities like international financial institutions or powerful nations can undermine a country's ability to make decisions that truly serve its own interests. By emphasizing strength and self-sufficiency, Traore aims to ensure that Burkina Faso retains control over its political, economic, and social affairs. Additionally, Traore's philosophy underscores the significance of national pride and dignity. He supports policies that empower Burkina Faso to assert its unique identity and carve out its own path of development, free from external interference or coercion. By fostering a sense of unity and purpose among the Burkinabe people, Traore strives to foster a resilient society that is united in advancing the nation's interests and values. But why are the African nations in economic decline and are left with no option but to take loans? Well, the poverty plaguing Black Africa today can, in part, be attributed to schemes aimed at manipulating leaders and destabilizing governments. Constructing a robust state demands adeptness in handling the tactics of dominant powers seeking to undermine and exert control over our nations. Among these tactics are the alleged promotion of human rights, the purported championing of freedom of expression, and the neo-colonial structures entrenched within our modern states. Burkina Faso's prime minister said that human rights serve as instruments of control wielded by the West over third world societies. They afford the West a means to ensure that its local allies, many of whom receive direct or indirect support, have the latitude to infiltrate state systems and weaken nations for the benefit of Western interests. Highlighting perceived double standards, the Prime Minister drew attention to instances such as the United States' actions, where individuals deemed threats to national security are eliminated without due process, often escaping international scrutiny. Instances of foreign interventions by global powers like the United States and France can be seen as having inflicted harm on local populations. Questioning the West's commitment to freedom of expression, the Prime Minister suggested that what the West defends is not genuine freedom of expression, but rather their ideological, political, and economic interests. The principles of freedom of expression and human rights are often manipulated to serve these interests in Western nations. Furthermore, the Prime Minister criticized local leaders who claim to support freedom of expression but restrict it for those with dissenting views. This inconsistency highlights the hypocrisy inherent in the application of freedom of expression principles and underscores the urgent need for a genuine and universally applied commitment to upholding human rights standards. What's more, the West employs social media platforms to spread their propaganda, censoring any comments that deviate from their approved viewpoints. The Prime Minister stressed the essence of authentic freedom of expression, which encompasses not only the right to express one's own opinions, but also the willingness to respect differing viewpoints, even those in opposition. Individuals who exploit freedom of expression to inflict harm on others pose a significant threat to society, as their actions impede the progress of their nation. Coming to the reason why African nations are left with no options but to take loans, the biggest reason is economic exploitation. The economic struggles experienced by numerous African nations can be traced back to a tangled history of economic exploitation, stretching from the colonial era to the post-independence period, marked by neo-colonialist policies and frameworks. During colonial times, European powers systematically exploited African countries, extracting natural resources and exploiting labor to serve their own economic interests. This exploitation laid the foundation for the underdevelopment and economic disparities that persist in many African nations today. Colonial powers established economic systems that favored their own interests at the expense of African nations. These systems involved the extraction of natural resources such as minerals, timber, and agricultural products, which were then exported to Europe for processing and consumption. This exploitative economic model left African economies heavily reliant on exporting raw materials, with little investment in infrastructure, industrialization, or human development. Additionally, colonial policies undermined local industries and agriculture, favoring imported goods over domestically produced ones. This hindered economic diversification and growth while perpetuating dependence on foreign markets and imports. The lasting effects of these colonial-era economic structures continue to hinder economic progress in many African countries, contributing to ongoing economic crises and vulnerabilities. After gaining independence, many African nations inherited neo-colonialist structures and policies that perpetuated economic dependence on former colonial powers and their allies. Neo-colonialism refers to the ongoing economic, political, and cultural dominance of former colonial powers over their former colonies, often through indirect means such as economic agreements, trade relations, and foreign aid. One significant aspect of neo-colonialism in Africa is the unequal trade relations between African countries and the West. African nations often face disadvantages in international trade, with their exports subject to tariffs, quotas, and other barriers that hinder market access and depress prices. Meanwhile, Western countries continue to benefit from favorable access to African markets and natural resources. Furthermore, African countries frequently carry unfair debt burdens resulting from loans obtained from international financial institutions established by the West, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These loans often come with stringent conditions known as structural adjustment programs or SAPs, which require recipient countries to implement austerity measures, privatize state-owned enterprises, and liberalize their economies. SAPs have faced widespread criticism for exacerbating poverty, inequality, and social unrest in African nations, as they prioritize debt repayment over long-term development and social welfare. Additionally, the terms of these loans are often negotiated on unequal terms, leaving African countries with little bargaining power and compelled to accept unfavorable conditions in exchange for financial assistance. On top of that, to repay these loans, African nations must take on more loans, creating a cycle of traps. But how does the IMF engage in covert activities that Ibrahim Traore knows about? At the core of this discussion lies the debt trap, wherein countries find themselves ensnared in a cycle of indebtedness, compelled to adhere to IMF directives that often serve the interests of Western powers, who constitute the IMF's primary financiers. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Founded in 1944, the IMF was initially established to promote global monetary cooperation, ensure financial stability, and facilitate international trade. Nevertheless, its interventions in Africa and other developing regions have eroded the autonomy of recipient countries. African nations frequently seek financial aid from the IMF, typically in the form of loans, when grappling with economic upheavals, escalating debt burdens, and limited access to capital markets. However, accepting IMF loans entails certain conditions. These loans come with stringent stipulations, known as structural adjustment programs, SAPs, which are aimed to superficially bring economic reforms and policy alterations. However, in the true sense, these adjustment programs are presented to ensure African nations remain in a debt trap and can never become economically independent. Because these SAPs are usually formulated by Western economists and policymakers, they reflect Western ideologies and interests rather than the unique circumstances of African nations. The imposition of SAPs infringes upon the sovereignty of African countries by compelling them to adopt externally dictated policies. This restricts the ability of African governments to formulate and implement policies that best serve the interests of their citizens. Instead, they are forced to prioritize loan repayment and adherence to IMF-mandated measures, even if these policies exacerbate poverty, inequality, and social unrest. Moreover, the IMF's involvement in Africa exacerbates existing power imbalances and perpetuates dependence on Western donors. By tying financial assistance to the adoption of SAPs, the IMF reinforces the dominance of Western economic ideologies and institutions, further solidifying the influence of Western powers in African affairs. The debt trap phenomenon is particularly pernicious, creating a cycle of dependency wherein African nations become increasingly indebted to the IMF and other international creditors. As countries struggle to repay loans, they are compelled to seek additional financing, perpetuating the cycle of debt and reliance. Furthermore, the conditions attached to IMF loans often exacerbate social and economic disparities within African countries. For instance, SAPs may necessitate reductions in social spending, such as healthcare and education, resulting in deteriorating living standards and heightened poverty levels, particularly among vulnerable populations. Beyond the economic implications, the IMF's interventions in Africa have come under scrutiny for their lack of transparency and accountability. Critics assert that IMF decision-making processes are secret and undemocratic, with limited input from affected countries and civil society organizations. This lack of transparency undermines trust in the IMF and diminishes its legitimacy as a global financial institution. But how does the IMF decide the price of natural resources and favors Western companies? Captain Ibrahim Traore has repeatedly asked why African nations are poor, despite having the largest reserves of natural resources. And now, he knows why. The International Monetary Fund significantly impacts the economies of many developing nations, often imposing terms that deeply affect their natural resources and raw materials. This influence is particularly evident in countries like Burkina Faso, which is blessed with ample reserves of gold and other valuable resources. However, the IMF's involvement in such nations frequently faces criticism for perpetuating a system where Western countries benefit at the expense of the developing world. Burkina Faso's abundant natural resources, including gold, offer both opportunities and challenges for its economic development. While these resources can generate substantial revenue and foster growth, they also expose Burkina Faso to exploitation by external parties seeking to maximize gains with minimal investment. The IMF's role in shaping economic policies and lending practices often exacerbates this vulnerability. By attaching financial assistance to compliance with prescribed reforms and austerity measures, the IMF influences how countries like Burkina Faso manage their natural resources, often prioritizing short-term gains for creditors and investors over long-term sustainable development. One way the IMF controls natural resource management is through its influence on pricing mechanisms. In Burkina Faso, where gold is a primary export, IMF policies directly impact global resource prices. By advocating policies favoring Western buyers and investors, the IMF depresses prices, allowing Western countries to access valuable resources at lower costs. In other words, the IMF uses the argument that African nations need money, and for that, they have to sell their natural resources at cheaper prices. However, instead of allowing all entities from the world to buy those resources, only Western entities are allowed. This ensures that the West gets all the precious resources at lower prices. This phenomenon, known as the resource curse, leads to economic challenges and social unrest in nations rich in natural resources due to mismanagement, corruption, and exploitation. In Burkina Faso and similar countries, IMF involvement can exacerbate these issues by reinforcing existing power imbalances and perpetuating dependency on Western markets. President Ibrahim Traore's rejection of IMF loans acknowledges these dynamics and asserts Burkina Faso's sovereignty and economic interests. By refusing IMF loan conditions, President Traore seeks greater control over the country's natural resources, ensuring they benefit citizens rather than external stakeholders. With only one order, Ibrahim Traore has failed all the West's plans to control Burkina Faso. Earlier, sanctions, security threats, and hard options were used, but Ibrahim Traore allowed nothing to intimidate him. Now, as the West was presenting its manipulative policy covered in financial assistance, Ibrahim Traore held it by the neck as well. But how does the West use the IMF to dictate elections so a West's puppet can be elected? At present, the biggest challenge for the West in Burkina Faso is Ibrahim Traore. It's because his bold plans are being executed, and this is taking Burkina Faso closer to Russia and China. Now, the West believes that the only way it can be stopped is by removing Ibrahim Traore from power. However, Ibrahim Traore has openly declared that elections are not a priority until reforms are made. That's when the West thought it should use the IMF for elections in Burkina Faso. However, the IMF has consistently come under fire for being seen as a tool used to promote the interests and agendas of Western powers, often at the expense of developing nations. This criticism arises from the IMF's governance structure, which heavily favors Western countries, particularly those with strong economies and significant financial contributions. As a result, the policies and conditions imposed by the IMF often align closely with Western priorities across economic, political, and strategic spheres. President Ibrahim Traore's stance on elections and national priorities provides a stark illustration of the clash between Western expectations and the realities of governance in developing countries. Traore's emphasis on security and constitutional reforms aimed at enhancing public welfare, rather than solely focusing on elections, challenges the prevailing Western notion that democracy and electoral processes are indispensable for achieving economic growth and development. By prioritizing security and constitutional changes geared towards improving public welfare, Traore asserts Burkina Faso's sovereignty and autonomy in determining its own development path. However, Western powers acknowledge that Traore's approach poses a challenge to their ability to exert influence and exploit Burkina Faso's resources and economy. They understand that as long as Traore remains in power and promotes policies that prioritize security and public welfare, their capacity to control and extract resources from Burkina Faso will be limited. Consequently, they seek to leverage institutions like the IMF to pressure Traore into adopting policies that better serve their interests. One tactic through which the West might attempt to shape Burkina Faso's political and economic landscape is by utilizing IMF loans and assistance. By tying financial support to the implementation of democratic reforms, including holding elections, the West can indirectly apply pressure on Traore to conform to their expectations regarding governance and economic management. They argue that democratic institutions are essential for attracting foreign investment and fostering economic growth, presenting these demands as necessary prerequisites for Burkina Faso's development. Nevertheless, Traore's rejection of the IMF's loan offer demonstrates his awareness of the potential consequences of accepting such assistance. By turning down IMF loans that come with conditions prioritizing democratic reforms over security and public welfare, Traore reaffirms Burkina Faso's independence and sovereignty in making decisions. He sends a clear message that Burkina Faso will not compromise its national priorities and interests to meet external demands, even if it means forgoing financial support from international institutions like the IMF. What do you think? Is Ibrahim Traore's decision to turn down a loan a genius one? Or did he need to take the loan and decline to follow any orders given by the IMF? In the comment section right below, share your thoughts on what next the West might try to secretly control Burkina Faso. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.